The Broken Brain is encouraging raising funds and donating needed supplies to the YWCA of Nashville and Middle Tennessee. For this month, the month of May 2024, I'm plugging the wish list that you can make purchases on. It's an Amazon wish list with affordable items that you can send. You can send 1, 2, or 100 of them, whatever is specified on there that they need, and whatever you can give. If you go to ywcanashville.com/donating, then you can find the Amazon wish list and make those purchases. Or you can make a direct donation there as well, and I'm encouraging everyone to do that. If you're not in a situation where you can make a monetary donation, please share the website ywcanashville.com/donating on your social media, please. And thank you so much for doing that. One quick thing too, any new patrons to the show, if you sign up on the patreon.com/brokenbrain for the entire remainder of 2024, 50% of your monthly donation will go towards supporting the shelter and outpatient programs there as well. And that's all the way to the end of 2024. If there are programs you'd like to see highlighted in future months or times, please hit me up at dwighthurst.com/contact. This is something that all of us together can make a difference if we take the time to do it.
The Broken Brain.
Recording in progress.
Welcome back, everybody, to the show. It's me, Dwight, here with the Broken Brain this week, bringing you a dose of health and wellness. And particularly today, we're getting all up into health and wellness. My guest today is Jeff Krasno, who is the co-founder and CEO of Commune and also host of the Commune podcast, which you'll tell us a little bit about that. You've created a lot of different wellness and protocols and recovery kind of oriented things for different kind of conditions that you call good stress, which is leads right into a cool conversation that we're going to have about it. But first of all, Jeff, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Dwight, it's such a pleasure to connect with you and to connect with your amazing community that you've built.
Well, thank you. And one of the things that I really love is bringing people to the listeners who have different things. One of the things I noticed as we were setting this up is you have a lot of really actionable kinds of like steps. You're very much a problem solver kind of personality when it comes to and hope and having some hope and control and feelings of empowerment, especially when it comes to our health and mental and physiological health is. Why that's just makes such a huge difference, when people have that versus when they don't. What can first of all, please introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about you and your story and what got you into worrying about people being healthy.
Yeah. Well, as usual, it's my wife's fault. We're childhood sweethearts, and I've really been her torchbearer for now 3.5 decades in some way or another. But kind of more specifically, I was in the music business, and I was running a record company and a management company in New York City in downtown Manhattan when September 11th occurred. And in the wake of that tragedy, my wife did something unexpected. And she started a yoga studio at Ground Zero. It was in the same office building where I had my record label. And she opened that in early 2002. And I basically got this front row seat to seeing the power of community and yoga and sweat and a spiritual practice, how that can bring people together and help them heal and transform their lives. And so, and this was not like a fancy yoga studio like Equinox or anything. This was like a funky little one-room studio with, cockeyed floors and a, bathroom like barely the width of a bread box. It's like, after class, people that basically were local, all the denizens there of Lower Manhattan that had gone through so much grief and collective grief, would gather in this tiny little vestibule with sweaty lycra and open hearts and really heal. And that had a really transformational impact on my life, and both personally and professionally. And from there, I started this company called Wanderlust, which ended up being a very, very large festival company for wellness. We sort of combined what a yoga conference and Lollapalooza might look like into one thing, and we brought that all around the world. Um, and it was an incredible experience for me and my family, because we were traveling really extensively. But unfortunately, running a health and wellness company was an adventure in wealth and hellness for me, because I got incredibly sick during that process. And, that kind of opened the door to kind of some personal healing that then I had to go through and face. And it was a huge eye-opening experience and learning experience for me, hopping into my own petri dish and doing a lot of me search. So that's a little snapshot. Now I've fortunately had the opportunity to sort of distill all of the things that I've learned into what I do every day, which is I run a company that is a wellness media company. So we make, online course content with incredible doctors and trauma-informed therapists, et cetera. And like Gabor Mate and other folks that you, and I'm sure some of your audience might be familiar with. And then, I get to host a podcast and talk to people 10 times smarter than me all the time.
I would say that's actually the best thing for me about doing a podcast, is the people I get to meet and talk to. Some of the coolest people that I've met in my life have come from being able to do this. It's also it's interesting when and I've been lucky enough to be around now to where a lot of times people will contact each other just as much often as I'll have to. But when I do hunt people down, right? When it's kind of like if you hear something, and I'm sure you probably run into this, when you hear of something cool. Someone's doing this cool thing. Someone's, on a different podcast, or someone, some video reel. It's like, that person I'm going to shoot them a message. Hey, do you want to, because I'd like to get to know them anyway. I'd like to hear what they have to say. But saying I have a podcast, it's a legitimate way of connecting, instead of just being like, hey, cool, you want to talk to me? Which might be off-putting. But anyway,
Right.
So meeting people, just like
it's
we're doing
the
now.
ultimate door opener, right?
Yeah. It's nice.
Yeah, totally. I'm sure, just from one podcast host to another, to pull back the curtain on the reality of the situation, it can sometimes be a slog. There's a tremendous amount of research and reading and prep that goes into, many of our episodes. But I think, like you say, the payoff is so great, because, we have this, deep personal connection for 60, 90 minutes at a time, where we're absolutely, completely present, to the moment. We're not thinking about anything else or checking any other notification or email or text. We're just completely right here. And in fact, in some ways, it is a form of practice.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me that you were running a wellness company and felt, right, that there were elements of that. And that point in your life, I guess, where you were having a lot of health problems and things yourself. Do you find, did you have to change the way you were conducting your own management? You're still managing a company. You still work in wellness, but did you have to look at if you were managing yourself in a wellness friendly way? Wellness friendly? I don't know. That's a good one.
All of the above, Dwight. Candidly, I had to re-examine my approach to leadership. I had to re-examine, my self-care practices or lack of self-care. There's this, precept that crosses almost every spiritual tradition. It's called the Golden Rule. Love thy neighbor as thyself. You're probably familiar with it. Mm-hmm. And we think about that often in terms of how much we should love thy neighbor, but actually, to really fulfill that equation, we have to truly love ourselves. And for many people, me included, for decades, I was always at the bottom of my own priority list. And, I felt that practices around self-care were indulgent. And, who was I? I was so privileged, really everyone else should come first. The problem with that, even though the intention or the instinct might be a good one, is that you become relatively useless as a human being. And you can't love your neighbor because you don't love yourself. And so, that was certainly part of, the journey, and remains part of the journey. There's really just no terminus to this, Dwight. I suppose there's the end of consciousness that might be coterminous with physical death, but until that point, we are just a process, and that process could be is on a trajectory towards wholeness or healing, or it's on a trajectory towards illness or ailing. And what I came to learn is that I have a lot more agency than I ever thought over the direction of that trajectory.
Mm-hmm. So, what would you explain as the definition of good stress? We've hit on that sometimes on the program, and it's one of the, in my experience working in mental health and as a therapist, right? It's one of the things that's most fascinating to me is the vast difference in the type of way we experience stress. So, what's good stress?
Yeah. Well, I think I saw somewhere in one of your interviews that you covered eustress, right? And that's, I suppose, the Greek prefix on stress. And that really points to kind of short, acute, often health conferring stress. So I'll just give you sort of by analogy with an experience, that I had of like about a week ago. I have these wonderful trails right near my house. They are inundated with coyotes. So I went before a podcast to clear my head, and I was walking on this trail, and my mom called. And I have a new rule to myself, is that anytime a member of my family calls, no matter what, I take the call. Even if I can't really talk for very long, I don't get into like endless text things. I just take the call. And so even though I just wanted some peace and quiet, I took the call from my mom. And, I was just walking, and she was talking, as she often does. And I heard a rustling kind of in the bramble. And then right in front of me, maybe about 10 feet, there was a coyote. And he sort of eyed me as potential lunch briefly. And of course, at that moment, I hung up the phone immediately. And my body had an involuntary adaptive stress response, right? So what happened? Well, we all kind of know this by our own direct experience, right? So my heart started pounding, my breath rate accelerated, my pupils dilated. I became very, very focused. But then sort of underneath the crust of consciousness, there's all this stuff happening in my body. There's a kind of cortisol starts coursing through your veins. It tells your liver to release glucose, to send it to your muscles, to, this is the normal fight or flight stress response. And so I didn't fight, obviously, in that particular case. I didn't fly. I kind of just stood my ground, and the coyote then just took a look and then just kind of went back off into the woods. And a couple minutes later, like, my body returned to homeostasis, to equilibrium. That is a completely adaptive response to stress. It comes and it goes. The problem with modern society is that the coyote really never leaves. So for so many of us, under neglect or abuse or constant work pressure or endless work hours, or we're subject to 24-hour news cycles and social media that are essentially geared to leverage our human negativity bias to make us chronically stressed. That stress response never never goes away. And that is patently bad stress and maladaptive stress. So I won't go into the physiology too deeply, and I'm sure your audience knows some of this, but when you have, chronic high cortisol levels, not only do you just feel irritable, but it has all sorts of downstream negative impacts. It raises blood glucose in your serum blood levels go way up, your glucose levels. So it can lead to insulin resistance and prediabetes and eventually potentially diabetes. Elevated cortisol levels also degrades the immune system. You produce less innate immune cells like neutrophils and monocytes and macrophages. And then at the same time, it degrades or creates dysbiosis in your gut. So it disrupts the balance of bacteria in your gut. That can lead to what is known as leaky gut, which then creates high levels of inflammation. So you have an agitated immune system and a depressed immune system at the same time. And your body basically just goes haywire. And we see this because stress, psychological stress, is so connected to so many physiological and mental disorders at this juncture. We know that we can draw a straight line from one to the other. So this is what bad stress is. And unfortunately, too many of us are familiar with that phenomenon. Good stress is very, very different. It's the self-imposition of short-term, deliberate stress. And it turns out that engaging in these good stress protocols align ourselves with how we evolved. Because if you think about what life was like on the Serengeti, 12,000 BC, it was brimming with harsh, sometimes very inhospitable stressors, right? So we were accustomed to dealing with a scarcity of food or a paucity of available calories. So, but our bodies then evolved in relation to that scarcity, and we learned how to store fat. So storing fat, for example, was very, very adaptive because it helped us prepare for winter's fallow, right? We also had to endure all sorts of massive fluctuations in temperature. We didn't have a nice little digital thermometer on our hut. So we had to get accustomed to wicked cold and wicked heat. And that led to other adaptive advantages. We built resilience. We built better metabolic health through subjection to cold and heat. And there's all sorts of things that you can point to. Obviously life on the Serengeti was full of physical labor. We walked 6 to 10 miles per day. We lifted heavy things. We didn't live like sedentary indoor desk jobs. And so really what I started to realize is that these good stressors actually align our bodies with their innate engineering that happened over hundreds of thousands of years of Homo sapiens history and millions of years of hominid history. And I began to codify those protocols into a program, an evolving program that I call good stress, that addresses a lot of these, evolutionary mismatches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, of course, we don't catch up in a generation or so, like evolutionarily, right? So, like the brain that we've formed and things. I remember reading once where, as soon as the light bulb became available, one of the next things that we invented was shift work, right? If you think about it.
Yeah, right.
To where
100%.
Now our sleep patterns are very different. And, even the way we sleep, it used to be, even in the early days that pre-industrialization and stuff, it was normal for people to kind of go to bed as the sun went down, and then they'd often wake up a few hours later and be awake for a few hours and then go back to sleep. There were 2 sleep shifts that naturally occurred, they think. And so then we start sort of screwing around with that as soon as we can. And now, of course, we can answer emails and texts and whatever it is. We can set up, whatever appointments and things just all the time. And we're not made to do that all the time. And just kind of what we're engaged with and what we're plugged into and unplugging from that. And yeah, we aren't geared towards that. That's not our, that's not our orientation. And I feel like, there isn't necessarily the differentiation when we look at that when it comes to stress. In fact, sometimes stress is almost a status symbol or an assumption that, well, that's just, that's how it is. And look at me, I'm going a million miles and isn't my life crazy? Like it's a badge of honor sometimes, right?
Yeah. I mean, Dwight, you put your thumb on so many different insights there. First of all, yes, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but from what I remember of biology, genes take a long time to change.
Yes.
So, if you look at the cresting tsunami of mental disorders and chronic diseases in our culture now, in comparison to where they were 50 or 60 years ago, you can't really point to the underlying genome. The genome has stayed the same. What hasn't stayed the same is culture, right? The way we live, our lifestyles. And so, I think your point there is right on. I mean, as it pertains to things like disruption of sleep and the epidemic of insomnia that we're looking at right now, yeah, that has everything to do with kind of innovation around light. And I put innovation in air quotes. Obviously, right now, there's about 8 screens around me right now. They're available to me at any time. In fact, I could watch Curb Your Enthusiasm on one. I could watch, YouTube on another, or
That's
whatever.
what that is in the background. I was wondering what that music was.
That's right. It's Larry David again, undermining me, as he's apt to do. But this. The ease and convenience and comfort of 24/7 on-demand entertainment is wonderful on some level, because I love Larry David as much as you might, but he's an endocrine disruptor. If amongst other things, it's always Larry's fault. But more seriously, we're engineered to have a certain circadian rhythm, and that circadian rhythm is set through getting subjection to the right kind of light at the right time of day. And when we disrupt that kind of light and we take blue light into the inferior part of our retina at night, we confuse our engineering and we say, hey, release cortisol when we should be releasing melatonin. So we are designed to get a good night's sleep, but then culture hijacks that design, and you can point your finger in 1,000 directions, where it does that. So, I think you kind of nailed it with your comments there.
Well, it's this kind of like, in a way, it reminds me of opiate analgesia, they say, where if you take painkillers too long, your body starts hurting more to compensate for it. And you take something like media, which we use to unwind. I know I do, right? And of course, it's amazing how accustomed we get to being like, well, I walk into the restaurant and they're like, your food's not quite ready yet for takeout. And so I'm like, okay, what's the next thing? It's in my hand. I don't remember pulling my phone out. I just did. So when we're using that to unwind, but it's actually winding us up is what you're describing. Sometimes the very things that I reach for a comfort are actually providing some of the difficulty in finding comfort.
Yeah, it is ironic that chronic ease leads to chronic dis-ease, but it's true.
Oh, I like that. I like that phrase, dis-ease or dizzy. Yeah. See, that's clever.
Yeah.
It's a lot better when I hang a lantern on it. But I'm I'm addicted to clever wordplay. I love clever things like that. So that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you say, we're just not comfortable with being bored anymore. Right? But we were not designed to take in this onslaught of information that is so concomitant with the attention economy. We were just simply not designed for it. So, when we see ourselves, having, panic attacks, for example, Well, it doesn't take, a Nobel laureate to connect the dots here, is that if you are always staring at a screen that is essentially designed to dysregulate your nervous system, what is going to happen? Well, we're seeing that. I have 3 daughters, man. And I know a lot about this stuff, but it's tough, man. It's tough for kids, particularly growing up in this kind of environment. And I think, Dwight, the other thing that you alluded to, which I find so disturbing, is that we have essentially normalized the abnormal. This idea that like being like quote unquote stressed out and sleepless and having chronic fatigue and brain fog and irritability and the inability to concentrate and the need to check our phone every 2 seconds, like we've essentially completely normalized that. In fact, we just can often write that stuff off as like, oh yeah, I'm just having a little bit of a bad day or whatever. But let me tell you, Dwight, like those symptoms that I just described, they are an angel's breath, or I should say maybe a devil's breath away from diabetes and dementia and heart disease. They are just upstream. So this is why I'm so passionate, candidly, about trying to get some of these points across. Because honestly, when I survey our country and the world, since we're actually very good at exporting our lifestyle around the world, what I see is just an epidemic of chronic disease. And I believe it's at the core of many of the world's problems. I mean, even honestly, our political discourse, I think, is inflamed. I think the inflammation that we have in our personal bodies spills over into the body politic. I mean, if you get up and you have 3 chronic conditions and can't afford your insulin and don't have insurance and you're working 2 part-time jobs in a town that's been boarded up and your only access for food is 7-Eleven, you're probably pissed off. So I really think
likely to engage. I mean, then you're also
Yeah.
And we can go, I won't get too lost in the weeds with particular perspectives, but I will say that you are more apt to be manipulated, whether it's by politicians or people selling you stuff or whatever, and also to make poor decisions and to be angry at those that feel differently than you. And we see a lot of those things accelerating, nowadays. So as we see this growing problem, what are some of the things that you advocate for people? If people say, I want to get up tomorrow and do it differently, or maybe we start with going to bed differently, but you can guide us that way. What are some things you tell people to do?
Well, on some level, I ask people to ask this simple question. If I want to be healthy and I want to feel great, then ask this question: how did I evolve? And when you ask that question, it really can inform so many different behaviors, and help you take agency over your own healthcare and take it back from insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies and honestly, just the medical care industry that is just so broken, that really is just hell-bent on treating the symptoms of disease, generally with drugs, and not addressing really what the root cause of many of our pathologies are. So ask yourself that question as it pertains to food, let's say. Well, how did I evolve? Well, I evolved primarily as an opportunistic omnivore. I ate 800 different kinds of plants and seeds and tubers and roots of all different colors. And I ate some, wild game, when it came along. So, lean protein, etc. When did I eat? Well, I certainly did not eat every second of the day. I was at a Denny's like a couple of years ago, I don't spend a lot of time at Denny's, but Dwight, I will
time we
inform
do
you that
spend
there are
there.
now.
No.
Yeah. I will now inform you that there are currently 4 meals per day. There are no longer 3 meals. There is breakfast served all day, thank God, lunch, dinner, and now late night.
Late night, right? There was
Late night is.
was it Taco Bell that introduced I remember seeing the commercial where it's like 4th meal. I'm like, oh, is that what we're?
You're like, is that
That's
what
not
we
even
really
so.
need?
That's not.
So yeah, I mean, we evolved to endure periods of some scarcity, as I mentioned before, and now we have to self-impose some of that scarcity in order to be well. So for me, that looks like an intermittent fasting protocol. Like I consolidate my consumption of food generally in an 8 to 9 hour window every day, and there's tons of good reasons to do that, from weight management to insulin sensitivity to the production of new mitochondria to the production of new neurons. There's so many, to the activation of autophagy, sort of the breaking down of dysfunctional cells. But more than anything, fasting is really a mindset that that can really punctuate other elements of your life. A lot of people associate fasting obviously with food, but Dwight, I think this is a place where physiology really bridges into psychology. So when I adopted a fasting protocol, it didn't mean that I didn't get hungry in the other 16 hours. I did. It would be 9 p.m. and it would be outside my eating window and I would get hungry. But I became sort of a disciple to the practice. And instead of just mindlessly, unconsciously walking over to the cupboard and grabbing a bag of chips the way I normally would have, I had to witness the nature of the hunger, right? So, and Viktor Frankl, who's this wonderful writer, he wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He has this very famous quote, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is, between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom, our liberation. It's a little bit longer than that, but I'll just paraphrase. And so I actually had to examine the nature of the stimulus, the hunger, and instead of unconsciously, mindlessly reacting to it and just going and get some food, I actually had to witness it and delineate between that feeling as a biological need or as an emotional or psychological desire. And I found that space through this practice in order to really untangle that. And I will say that 95% of the time, I found that I was eating my feelings, or I was bored, or someone insulted me, or something, and I was eating for psychological reasons. And I will say the refinement of that skill, of that mindset, then begin to bleed or punctuate other parts of my life, such that, like, when my kids did something incredibly aggravating, as they are apt to do, instead of just reacting, I had to examine the nature of the stimulus of their behavior. And instead of just lashing out, just be like, well, wait a minute. What would be the origin of that behavior? Why are they acting that way? And what is the appropriate response? And again, like, I started using this skill as it pertained to drinking or shopping or, whatever your peccadillo or your perfidy is, this became so, so useful. So I really feel like, that the self-imposition of scarcity in one's life can provide that space essentially between stimulus and response, and there is a tremendous amount of freedom in it.
That reminds me of as a colleague of mine, David Livingston is his name. He's one of the co-hosts of another podcast that I've mentioned it on here before. It's put on by the Wiseman Method, Rapid Detoxification clinic in Los Angeles, where you are. But
Oh, cool.
anyway, David is a great therapist. He helps people to transition from being like, going through opioid use disorder to going through and sobriety. But one of the things that I've heard him talk about many times is the usefulness of boredom. And he talks to people about this, of like how if there's addictive practices, and this is a clinic that goes way beyond just the idea of just opiates. They look at it as a medical treatment, and they take a medical eval of everything. So, but anyway, just I guess I say that just to mention David's mindset is saying not just the drugs, but other practices that we do to fill the void of boredom. It's sometimes better to have that boredom, because then boredom will breed cleverness, is the way he describes that, right? And I think it's a powerful concept to say, as you put it, I really like your term, imposed scarcity, because if I'm not eating, gotta do something. And as you put it, confronting that, right, and actually emotionally processing, why am I doing this? What am I trying to escape from, or maybe create, that it's not really working?
Well, yeah, I mean, I haven't thought about it in these terms before, but you could also apply that concept of imposed scarcity on media, right? And so instead of like you're waiting in the line at the grocery store, instead of taking another, dopamine hit on Instagram, just be present to your situation, to the person at the register, or the person in front of you, or the person behind you, etc. What is going to be the state of your nervous system if you do that? Probably very chill and relaxed, what might be called sort of ventral vagal, where you become open, your sort of aperture of attention widens, you become more attuned, more relatable. And it's in that place of safety and security where you build relationship and generally find creativity and wisdom. And we are a culture that is obsessed with filling every empty space, but wisdom comes in the spaces, right? So we need to let it be. We need to open the possibility for more wisdom.
What do you say when people are struggling with getting started on something like this? As you put it, you pushed ahead into, getting to where boy, this is actually feeling like it's helping me. I'm processing these things. We have such a hard time starting anything that can be, you're right, healthy practices, especially when it comes to imposing scarcity, as you put it, or changing what we're doing, right?
Yeah. Well, what's the quote? A journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, right?
Sure, yeah.
And this is, so for example, like I'm a daily cold plunger. Okay. I abhor the cold. I literally hate the cold, Dwight. I hate it almost more than anything. But I didn't start cold plunging with 34-degree water. I started with 60-degree water for 30 seconds, and that even felt subjectively incredibly uncomfortable, but uncomfortable to the place where I could do it. And slowly, over time, decrease temperature and increase duration of my cold plunge. Okay. We don't have to get into all the benefits of cold plunging. It's fantastic.
A lot of people are doing that. Either that or even cold, just a swim or, kind of a thing.
Sure.
Yeah,
well, I mean, for mental health and mood regulation, it's pretty incredible. It will stimulate the release of dopamine over a 48-hour period. And obviously in a very adaptive way, because it's also incredibly metabolically, positive. So there's a lot of very negative behaviors that also trigger the activation of dopamine, right? So dopamine is sort of a Jekyll and Hyde sort of neurotransmitter.
Gotcha.
But this is a very, very positive way. And so cold plunging honestly can be a great therapy for addiction and recovery for that very reason, because neurochemically it seems to have a very, very like a response that is not dissimilar from drugs and alcohol. But that being said, really the question, the first question was, how do you start? So 4 years ago, I was 210 pounds. I had all those shitty symptoms of modernity, chronic fatigue, brain fog, etc. I found out that I was diabetic. I ran a wellness company, mind you, and then I became one of these statistics. I was living in the nightmare, but I had to start somewhere, and the place to start was tiny, tiny little steps. I mean, I didn't go into like a 16/8 fasting protocol on day one. I just went into like, okay, I'm not going to eat for 12 hours today. I can manage that today, right? I'm going to take a cold shower for 20 seconds just today. Just today. That's it. I'm going to go on a walk after every meal for 10 minutes today. I can manage that, right? And over time you start to stack these things up and you start to take inventory of yourself and you're like, oh my God, I've created an upward spiral in my life. Like we almost always think of spirals as downward. And they are. There are plenty of downward spirals. We've all experienced them at points in our life. I'm sure many people listening have experienced a downward spiral. I'm here to tell you that upward spirals are just as possible.
It's interesting how we overcome, there's some kind of a hurdle to anything healthy, I think, to where we do it enough times that it becomes somewhat self-reinforcing. I know when I've been through periods of time where I've done something like running, for example. I used to run pretty often. And even though running, that's the old joke, running's the worst, right? I mean, everybody knows that. It always sucks, right? But yet I got to a point where I look forward to it for the mental and physiological kind of muscular feelings, that you get afterwards. Because for various reasons, it was a break from the day. It got me up and moving around and felt better after that kind of thing. But it takes a minute to get to that point where it's not just awful. And enough to where even the parts that remain awful or hard work or whatever are overshadowed by what's enjoyable about it. Or I guess as you're putting it, it's like you didn't start describing cold plunge by saying like, now I like it. But it sounds like you like some of the things that it does for you. And does that make it more tolerable to be able to jump in the cold water because the effects now are reinforcing?
Yeah. I think once it would become comfortable, it would lose its benefits, candidly.
I see.
And so I think we have to become comfortable with discomfort. And cold water is actually a good example because it's incredibly subjective. What's cold to me might not be cold to you, and vice versa. And the amazing thing about cold is that you can get all the benefits at any temperature, provided that it actually feels cold. But here's the other place where I find cold therapy to be so interesting. Again, like it's similar to the coyote. What happens when you get in to a cold plunge? Well, take a big deep breath, right? Takes your breath away. Your heart rate goes boom, 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 boom. There's epinephrine coursing through your veins. You almost feel it coming up like you're going to have a panic attack. And then you have a moment, you have some space where you leverage your neomammalian prefrontal cortex and you put top down pressure on this bottom up involuntary response. And you say, I have this tool. I can regulate my breath. Let me do it.
So it ties
okay.
into, it really ties into some of the ways that people will train for meditative breathing. Box breathing is one, belly breathing, controlled breathing, where a lot of them involve obviously deeper breathing than you usually would do, but a lot of them involve some at least of a few seconds of holding breath in between breaths and in between breathing in, hold it, breathe out, hold it. Those are some of the more simple self-calming techniques. And that's how I've heard that explained from a doctor before too, is that you're initiating, even if it's just a little, you're triggering a part where there's like a little bit of like, hey, what's going on? There's a physiological response to like not having air coming in, and then you're letting go. So it emphasizes a lot of different things psychologically as well.
Yeah, well, you're taking something that is generally happening subconsciously, like your breath, and you're putting conscious control over it, and such that you are moving your body back into a regulated state. And if you can do that day in and day out in cold water, you can also do it when something else stressful enters your life when you don't expect it. So really what this is training yourself for a certain amount of resilience and emotional regulation, such that when someone cuts you off in traffic, or you get insulted, or something very legitimately stressful happens in your life, that you have a tool to put top-down pressure onto that involuntary response and bring yourself back into an emotionally regulated place. It is an incredibly useful skill.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you've got right away some things people are able to do to kind of start out, as you put it, that we're kind of looking at. And I love principles that we can apply, by the way, that kind of like experiential scarcity that we can impose, on ourselves and our lives and things like that. What's the role of involvement of people around you, having a community or a support system? Like, let's say somebody has their family or partner or whatever, and maybe they're not quite like, well, I'm not going to jump in the cold water myself, but how important is that kind of support or communication in this?
Well, community in general is one of the biggest determinants of health and well-being. Of course, again, we ask ourselves, how did we evolve? Well, we evolved living communally. We literally raised each other's children. And, there's all these kind of studies now that have come out on the impacts of loneliness, which seems kind of rampant in our society at this juncture. That there's one out of BYU that essentially claims that loneliness is as big of a determinant of all-cause mortality as smoking 16 cigarettes a day, and more dangerous than obesity or alcoholism. So, we tend to think that we can go it our own in modern life, and certainly we have sanctified, the individual in our modern culture. But we know through any cursory look at evolution, but also at some of the more recent studies about these places in the world called blue zones, that are, the places that have the highest concentration of centenarians, that community is completely central to being well and healthy. And there's even this emerging field called sociogenomics that essentially tracks the effect of social connections on your genetics, on the expression of your particular genes, such that when your social needs are met by your social connections, your epigenetic expression is going to be way, way healthier. And I'll just kind of, punctuate this point by saying, I interviewed this guy named Robert Waldinger maybe last year, he runs the longest and most thorough longitudinal study on human happiness at Harvard University. And they've been studying this group of Harvard sophomores and a control group since, I think, the late 30s. And they found that the number one determinant of longevity and happiness was the strengths of one's social connections, period. So, the notion, of building community is central. I mean, obviously, I called my company Commune for a reason.
Yeah.
But of course, I think, we've yet to fully understand, the impact that the shelter in place and quarantine regulations during COVID have had. Certainly we're beginning to see kind of the ramifications on our young people, but also just at society at large in terms of, this loneliness epidemic, and of course, like, we can hole ourselves up in boxes inside of boxes inside of boxes, like single family homes and, gated communities and picket fences and, order everything in on Amazon from the palm of our hand and sort of live under the delusion that we are not interdependent with the world around us. But we do that really at our own risk.
Very much. In fact, I have a friend who's a manager, and he was looking into lots of research. I was talking the other day. He said that research indicates that people think that they prefer working at home, but yet if they don't have at least a couple days a week of some of that interaction in that, the morale just plummets, and that there are those things. So there are times, once again, where we kind of can even self-medicate with solitude. And subjective, some people do better with some of that than others and recharge the batteries. But if we're just recharging the batteries and not using the energy, right, then the thing we're comforting ourselves with can actually be to our detriment, as you put it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously there's an important delineation between chosen solitude, right? This notion of being sort of comfortable with oneself and not being lonely with oneself, and living a self-examined and spiritual life, which is very important. Candidly, a lot of my deepest feelings of connection come within chosen solitude. But then, that's very different than actually being lonely, of not spending time, really working on building your social connections to meet your social needs. In my program, I actually outline what I call a social fitness regimen, because in this day and age, candidly, we need to exercise our social biceps in the same way that we need to exercise, like, literally our physical biceps, because we've become so removed from socialization. And so, there's a lot of, just techniques. I think I revealed one at the beginning when I said, like, I always answer the phone now when a member of my family calls. It's so easy to look at your phone and be like, oh, there's dad, or there's my brother, whatever. And you just go directly to voicemail, like, I'm busy, I'll get back to them later. I get it. But what if you just picked up the phone for 30 seconds and say, like, my daughter called me this morning. I was really busy in the middle of some other conversation. I just said, hey, hold on 1 second. My daughter's calling. I picked up the phone. I say, hey, Phoebe, I love you so much, but I just can't talk to you right now. I'll call you back in 30 minutes. And she said, okay, Dad, I love you too. Just that. You stack those little behaviors up, and it really begins to perfume your life.
Instead of scheduling yourself an expectation obligation for later that you will, if you're me, that you will forget. That would be the way my brain works.
Totally. Well, and just practically, how many times have we then gotten into, like, this 50 texts back and forth to talk to someone in 3 hours versus just, picking up the phone and saying, hey, I'll call you at 5. So,
Well, it's very useful. As I said at the beginning, I think it's very powerful to have actionable steps we can use to empower ourselves, and you've given us a lot to work with. I want you to have a chance to tell people how to follow your work. Before that, I always like to ask people if they have a community give back that they like, whether it's a nonprofit, a charity, or just a good practice for the community. It does not have to be related to what we're talking about, but it can be. It's up to you. And then of course, kind of tell everybody where they can follow you and find you. But do you have any thing like that is near and dear to your heart?
Yeah, I have a couple. Thanks for asking that question. I'm super into regenerative farming. And I support a couple different groups. One's called Kiss the Ground. The other one is called Farmer's Footprint. They help conventional farmers transition to regenerative practices. And there's just so many reasons why that's a good idea. That's a different podcast, but I'm happy to come on and talk about that sometime.
That's pretty cool. Yeah.
And then I'm fortunate to serve on a nonprofit board called Pure Edge that has developed a mindfulness and a socio-emotional learning program for kids, mostly elementary school, but K through 12. They give the curriculum away, and they go into public schools all across the country and, teach our children tools to manage stress and anxiety. So that's something I believe in deeply.
I love that, especially, giving kids those tools. I'm glad to see that we are doing that a little more proactively. And
a little bit.
I see the trend. It's like so many things we know we should, and then hopefully we start to do. So anything like that that's happening, I think is really powerful. Where do people follow your work, and how can they benefit from you?
Yeah. So, well, I do prowl the Serengeti of social media, mostly on Instagram. So
mostly
I'm just
at like 11 midnight, 3 a.m.
Yeah. Try to avoid that. That's just at Jeff Krasno. But most of my work is concentrated on the commune platform. So that's at commune.com. I have a program up there, which you can take. The first half of it is totally free. It's called Good Stress. I outline all of the practices and benefits of many of the protocols that we've talked about, from heat and cold therapy to fasting to resistance training, to even really tips in how to have good, stressful conversations. That's a whole other world.
That's a good one too.
Yeah. And I host a podcast called the Commune Podcast, and I get to have really just fascinating conversations there. So those are the primary places.
Wonderful. And is that just one that's in all the podcast platforms out there people can follow?
Yeah. Every podcatcher.
Excellent. All right. Well, and to everybody out there, thank you so much for listening. And I'll also throw out as I always do, my website is dwighthurst.com, where you can learn more about the broken brain or my practice that I do there. And there is a growing number of resources that are available for you there, and some mental health courses and things that I'm putting up. I'm almost got ready to post some of the dialectical behavioral therapy. It's a self-study course for DBT skills that's going to be up there as well for people to learn something about those things. And just basically dwighthurst.com. Visit it, daily. And maybe not that often, but you can visit it whenever to see what we're adding there. So, Jeff, thanks again for being here.
Yeah, I loved it. Thank you, Dwight, and thank you for opening the doors to your community. I deeply appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Court Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Court Arts shows, visit courtamparts.com.